In the summer of 1996, in a small newsroom in Salt Lake City, a reporter picked up the telephone and heard a voice on the other end describe a wolf that would not die. The story that followed would travel from a Utah ranch to a billionaire's desk in Las Vegas, and from there, quietly, patiently, all the way to the budget of the Pentagon. Tonight, we'll follow that story from the ridgeline down. Settle in now. Let your shoulders soften, let your breath grow long, and let the world outside the window slip away as we travel together to a high, quiet basin in the American West. We begin, as so many stories in the West begin, with the land. Long before there was a ranch, long before there was a name for it in any newspaper, there was the Uinta Basin. Say the word slowly to yourself, Uinta. It comes down to us through the Ute language from the people who lived on that land and whose descendants live there still. The basin lies in the northeastern corner of Utah, tucked between the Wasatch Mountains to the west and the Uinta Mountains to the north, the only major range in the lower 48 of the United States that runs east to west rather than north to south. Something about the geography here has always seemed slightly turned, slightly out of alignment with the rest of the country. Imagine, if you would, standing on the rim of the basin at dusk, looking out over its floor. The land drops away beneath you in a soft, immense bowl, 5,000 feet above sea level here, higher still where the mountains rise. The air is thin and cool and dry, and it carries the scent of sagebrush and juniper, and beneath that, faintly, the mineral scent of very old stone. To your north, snowfields cling to the shoulders of the mountains even in high summer. To your south, cliffs step down in two great tiers, the Roan cliffs first, then the Book cliffs beyond them, like a stone staircase leading down into the deeper deserts of the Colorado Plateau. And beneath your feet, if you could see through the layers of the earth, you would find a story stranger than any that will be told at any ranch. The Uinta Basin was once the floor of a lake, a vast lake, an inland sea, that lay here during the age when the mountains were still rising. For millions of years, sediment settled on that lake bed. The remains of countless small lives drifted down and were pressed into the mud. Over time, that mud became shale, and the organic remains of those small lives became oil and gas and gilsonite and wurtzilite and ozokerite, hydrocarbons with strange and wonderful names tucked in the rock like secrets. The basin today is one of the great oil-producing regions of the American West. Drive its back roads, and you will pass pump jacks nodding slowly in the sagebrush, their movements as patient as anything on earth. But the basin is also known for something else. Ever since the 1950s, the years just after the Second World War, when the country was learning a new word, unidentified flying object, the Uinta Basin has been one of the most persistent sighting corridors in North America. Lights in the sky, lights on the ground, lights that hover and lights that dart, and lights that seem to those who see them to notice being seen. A Utah scientist named Frank Salisbury spent years collecting the reports. There were hundreds of them, then thousands, ordinary ranchers, off-duty deputies, truck drivers on the long empty stretches of Highway 40, housewives hanging out laundry at dusk, none of them selling anything, none of them wanting anything, just describing what they had seen or thought they had seen in a sky that seemed, in this particular pocket of the American West, to be a little more crowded than skies elsewhere. Why here? That is the question every visitor to the basin asks sooner or later, and no one truly knows. Perhaps it is the geography, Perhaps it is the geology. Perhaps it is the way the land itself opens up into that wide, wide bowl so that anything moving in the air becomes visible for many, many miles. Or perhaps, as the older residents of the basin will tell you, over coffee, in a diner, if they trust you enough, it is something else entirely. Because the basin was not empty when the settlers arrived. The Ute people had lived on this land for centuries, and their ancestors had lived here for centuries before that, and their ancestors' ancestors had lived here since a time so long ago that the memory of it survives only in stories. The Utes call themselves Nuchi'u, which means simply the people. They are Numic speakers, distant cousins of the Shoshone, of the Paiute, of the Comanche, who would one day break away from them and become the great horse lords of the southern plains. But the Utes remained close to their mountains. They knew the passes and the springs. They knew where the game moved in each season. They knew which valleys held good water and which valleys did not. And they knew, according to their oldest traditions, which places to avoid. There is a ridge above what we now call Skinwalker Ranch, a long, low ridge that rises out of the basin floor. And for as long as anyone can remember, the Utes have said that ridge is not a place to go. They have said it is cursed. They have said that during the Ute wars with the Navajo long ago, the Navajo placed something there. A witch, some say, or a curse, or a spell, that the Utes have never been able to lift. And so, the Utes have kept their distance. They have gone around it. They have not hunted on it. They have not camped near it. They have watched it from the corner of their eye, and they have not spoken of it much to outsiders, because things spoken of are things given power. The word that has attached itself to that ridge and to the ranch below it is a Navajo word, not a Ute one, though the two peoples have shared centuries of neighborhood in this corner of the world. The word is Ye Naldlushi. It translates roughly as by means of it, it goes on all fours. In English, we have shortened it, perhaps clumsily, into a single compound word, Skinwalker. In Navajo tradition, the Skinwalker is a kind of witch, not a healer. The healers are called by other names, and the healers are respected and beloved in Navajo life. The Skinwalker is the opposite of the healer. The Skinwalker is a person who has chosen darkness, and the Skinwalker, according to the old stories, has the ability to wear the skin of an animal and to move through the world as that animal, a coyote or a wolf or a large bird or something else, while remaining, in some hidden part, human. The stories are rarely told outside of Navajo homes. They are not the sort of stories that get shared with strangers around a campfire. They are held close and told carefully, and only in the right circumstances. But everyone in the Four Corners country knows that the stories exist, and in the Uinta Basin, on that low ridge above the Sherman Ranch, the old warnings echoed forward from the Ute grandmothers into the 20th century. For a long time, though, the ranch itself was just a ranch. Let us pause there for a moment. Let us stand at the edge of that property in the years before the story begins and see what we can see. The ranch is 512 acres. That is not a large ranch by the standards of the West, but it is a working piece of land, irrigated in places, sagebrush in others, with pastures for cattle and stands of cottonwoods along the drainage that runs across the property. There is a small house, there are outbuildings, there are fences. To the west, the land rises to that low mesa the Utes had always avoided. To the east, the land falls away toward the Uinta and Ouray reservation, where the Ute people, forced from the great sweep of Colorado and Utah in the 19th century, still make their home. The border of the ranch and the reservation lies close, close enough that on a still night you could hear a dog bark from one to the other. Before the story became famous, the ranch had a long chain of owners going back 100 years and more. There were the Locks and the Bryants in the earliest years of the 20th century. Then, from 1934 until 1994, the ranch belonged to a family named Myers, Kenneth and Edith Myers. 60 years they lived there. 60 years of ordinary days, of ordinary weather, of calving in the spring and haying in the summer and hunkering down through the long winter cold. When journalists later asked the Myers family whether anything strange had happened during their 60 years on the property, the answer was simple. No, nothing, not a thing. That is worth holding in mind as the story unfolds. 60 years of quiet before whatever came next. In the summer of 1994, the Myers family sold the ranch. The buyers were a couple named Terry and Gwen Sherman, and it is here, with the arrival of the Shermans, that the story begins to bend. The Shermans were ranchers, working ranchers, people who had spent their lives around cattle and horses and the long, slow rhythms of animal husbandry. They came to the Uinta Basin looking for a piece of land they could work, and they found it in that 512 acres east of Ballard, Utah. They put their savings into it. They moved in. They began, in the way of ranchers everywhere, to make it their own. And then, according to what they would later tell reporters and investigators and the family friends who listened over kitchen tables in the small towns of the basin, things began to happen. Not all at once, not dramatically, just things. The first was the wolf. That is the story the Shermans would tell most often when pressed, though even then they told it with a certain hesitation, as though they were still, years later, not quite sure what they had seen. They had been out working in the pasture one afternoon, they said, when a large wolf appeared, not a coyote, not a stray dog, a wolf. And this was strange in itself because wolves had been absent from that part of Utah for a very long time. Wolves were things of the far north country, or the deep wilderness, not of a working ranch on the edge of the Uinta reservation. The wolf, they said, was not afraid. It came near. It came very near. It approached one of their calves, and when Terry Sherman, alarmed, fired at it, the wolf did not run. It did not fall. It did not seem, in any way, to have been affected by the bullet. He fired again, and still the wolf stood there, they said, and looked at him, and then, eventually, it simply turned and walked away, unhurried, unharmed, disappearing into the willows along the creek. Terry Sherman was a hunter. He was a rancher who had shot many animals in his life. He knew what a bullet did to flesh, and whatever had happened out there in the pasture, he could not explain it. He was not the sort of man given to fanciful thinking. He talked about it slowly, later, as if picking his way through the memory to see if it might yet turn out to have been something ordinary. But it never did. Then there were the cattle. If you have never seen a case of what came, in the 1970s, to be called cattle mutilation, it is difficult to describe. The stories had been circulating in the West since the late 1960s. A rancher would go out in the morning to check his herd and find one of the animals dead. Nothing unusual in itself. Cattle die on ranches all the time. But the way these particular deaths would look was, in some cases, unsettling. Certain parts of the animal would be gone, an ear, an eye, the tongue, the soft tissues of the udder or the genitals or the anus, and the cuts, the ranchers would say, looked clean, surgical, precise. as though someone with a very sharp instrument and a great deal of skill had come in the night and removed exactly what they wanted and left. Scientists examining the phenomenon would offer a range of explanations. Predation, they said, could produce similar results, the soft tissues of a dead animal being the first to be consumed by scavengers, the drying and contraction of skin around wounds mimicking the appearance of clean cuts. Blowflies and coyotes and vultures could do a great deal in a short time, and what looked mysterious to a grieving rancher in the morning could sometimes be explained by ordinary biology, given a careful enough necropsy, but not always, not every case. Some cases resisted explanation, even by the veterinary experts, and on the Sherman Ranch in the mid-1990s, several of the cattle died in ways that Terry Sherman said he could not account for. Cattle that had been healthy the day before, cattle that showed no signs of struggle, no tracks around them, no blood on the ground, cattle that seemed, in Sherman's telling, to have been opened and closed again by hands that were not human, or at least by hands that were not the hands of anyone he knew. And then there were the lights. The lights were what Terry Sherman found hardest to describe and hardest to forget. They came out of the ground, he said, or out of the water, or out of the air just above the pasture, small at first, orbs he called them, sometimes blue, sometimes yellow, sometimes red, sometimes shifting from one colour to another as they moved. They would drift across the ranch at night, not fast, not slow, moving in ways that no aircraft moved. Sometimes they seemed to enter the house through the walls. Sometimes they seemed to hover above the corrals. Sometimes his dogs, the ones who had been steady, capable working dogs their whole lives, would run at the lights, barking, and would not come back, just gone. Not one dog, but several, over the months. The lights and the wolf and the cattle and the shapes on the ridgeline and the sense. This was the thing that Gwen Sherman found hardest to bear, the sense that something was watching, not now and then, always, from the ridge, from the trees, from the shadows just beyond the reach of the porch light, the feeling of being observed patiently, endlessly, by something whose intentions were unknowable. The Shermans stayed on the ranch for a little over 18 months, and then, in 1996, they gave up. They went to a reporter at the Deseret News in Salt Lake City, and they told him their story because they had to tell someone, and because they were preparing to leave. The reporter listened. He wrote it up. And in June of that year, an article appeared in the newspaper describing the strange events on a ranch in the Uinta Basin. It was not a large article. It ran in the paper and, in the ordinary way of newspaper articles, might have been forgotten in a week. But it was not forgotten. Because down in Las Vegas, 600 miles to the south, someone was reading. Let us take a breath here. Let us leave the ridge for a moment, and let us fly south across the desert, over the Colorado River, past the red bluffs of the Grand Canyon country, and down into the wide, bright bowl of the Las Vegas Valley. The city is spread out below us in its grid of lights, brilliant and restless, and somewhere in an office in that city, a man is sitting behind a desk, and he has just finished reading a newspaper article about a ranch in Utah. His name is Robert Bigelow. He was born in Las Vegas in the spring of 1944, and he had grown up there in the years when the desert around the city was still empty enough that atomic weapons could be tested at a place called the Nevada National Security Site, some 70 miles to the northwest. As a boy, Bigelow had seen the flashes of those tests on the horizon. He had grown up with the low rumble of the shock waves rolling across the desert. His childhood had a kind of edge to it that childhoods elsewhere did not have, an edge of the strange and the unknown, brought right up against the ordinary suburbs of a growing western city. Bigelow went into real estate. He was very good at it. He built and bought hotels and motels and apartment complexes all through the 70s and 80s and 90s, and by the middle of that last decade, he was a rich man. Not the flashy rich of some Vegas figures. Bigelow was quiet, private, careful. His wealth came from a chain of extended-stay hotels called Budget Suites of America, which he had founded in 1987, and which had grown into a small empire across the Southwest. 15,000 units built, 8,000 more purchased. He had, by any reasonable measure, more money than he needed to live on for the rest of his life. But real estate was not what Robert Bigelow cared about. Real estate was the means. The ends were somewhere else altogether. Bigelow had always been interested in the strange, in UFOs, in ghosts, in parapsychology, in the question of what happens after we die, in the fringes of what science was willing to discuss out loud. His grandmother, some accounts say, had had an experience with an unidentified flying object when Bigelow was young, and it had marked him. He had decided sometime in his youth that he wanted to spend his life not just accumulating wealth, but using that wealth to look into the questions that most people were too embarrassed to ask. In 1995, he had founded a research organization called the National Institute for Discovery Science, NIDES, as it came to be known. He hired scientists, physicists, biologists, retired military officers, former police detectives, and gave them a mission to investigate anomalous phenomena with the tools of standard scientific inquiry, without embarrassment and without shortcuts. They would use cameras and instruments. They would keep records. They would apply, as far as possible, the ordinary methods of ordinary science to subjects that ordinary science had, for the most part, refused to touch. And in that summer of 1996, sitting at his desk in Las Vegas, Bigelow read the article about the Shermans, and he picked up the telephone. The negotiations went quickly. The Shermans wanted out. Bigelow wanted in. In August of 1996, Robert Bigelow bought the ranch for approximately $200,000. He kept the transaction quiet, and he asked Terry Sherman to stay on as a caretaker so that the operations of the ranch could continue without drawing attention. Then he began, methodically, to move his scientists in. Imagine now that first team arriving. Imagine the trucks pulling up the dirt road to the ranch, kicking up dust in the late summer heat. Imagine crates of equipment being unloaded, cameras, motion sensors, magnetometers, radio receivers, night vision optics. Imagine the trailers being set up near the main house so that observers could live on site 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, in shifts. Imagine what it would have felt like to be one of those first scientists, to have spent a career in a mainstream laboratory, and now to find yourself, in your 50s, in a tin trailer in the Utah desert, holding a video camera at 4 a.m, watching a pasture for lights. The head of the investigation was a biochemist named Colum Kelleher. He was a serious man, careful, and he had come to Bigelow's organization after years of ordinary academic work. Kelleher would later co-author a book about the ranch, along with a Las Vegas journalist named George Knapp, and the book would become the seed from which everything that followed would grow. But at the beginning, Kelleher was simply doing what scientists do. He was looking, he was measuring, he was waiting, and what they saw, or what they said they saw, over the next several years, this is where the story becomes difficult to hold on to, because the incidents piled up, almost 100 of them by Kelleher's own account, sightings, sounds, objects appearing where nothing had been before, lights again and again and again, large animals with red eyes that seemed impervious to bullets, invisible forces that damaged equipment, cameras that failed at the crucial moment over and over, so often that the failure itself began to seem like part of the phenomenon, as though the ranch, whatever it was, knew when it was being watched, and knew when to withhold what it might otherwise have shown. Retired U.S. Army Colonel John Alexander, who was involved in the effort, described it later as an attempt to apply, as he put it, a standard scientific approach. But even he admitted in careful language that the investigators had had difficulty obtaining evidence consistent with scientific publication, which is to say, they saw a great deal, and they measured a great deal, but when they sat down to write it up in the way scientists must write things up, the results did not quite hold together. There were always gaps, there were always caveats, there were always reasons why any given incident could not quite be presented as proof. The skeptics, of course, had their explanations. A skeptical author named Robert Schaefer would later argue that the phenomena at Skinwalker Ranch were, almost certainly, illusory. He pointed to the Myers family, who had lived there for 60 years without incident. He suggested that the Sherman stories might have been invented, or elaborated, or misremembered prior to the sale. He noted that Bigelow, in the language of skeptics, had been described by James Randi in 1996 as the recipient of a tongue-in-cheek Pegasus Award for funding what Randi called the most useless study of a supernatural, paranormal, or occult claim. It was not a kind assessment, but the skeptics were not the ones on the ranch. The skeptics were not the ones sitting in the trailer at 4 a.m, watching a pasture with a night vision camera, listening to the wind in the cottonwoods and the distant call of coyotes, feeling the hair on the back of their neck stand up for reasons they could not name. Whatever the truth of Skinwalker Ranch, the people who were there believed there was something to see, and they kept looking. Now, let us slow down, and let us breathe, and let us follow the story one thread deeper. Because the strange thing about Skinwalker Ranch is not that it exists. Places like Skinwalker Ranch exist, or seem to exist, in many parts of the world. What is strange about Skinwalker Ranch is what happened next. What is strange is that this small ranch in Utah, in the years after Bigelow bought it, became the quiet center of a story that would travel, improbably, all the way to the United States Senate and to the Pentagon and to the budget of the Department of Defense. The connecting thread was a journalist. His name was George Knapp. Say his name gently and remember it, because he threads through this whole story from beginning to end. Knapp was a Las Vegas reporter. He worked at Channel 8, the CBS affiliate in that city, KLAS-TV, and he had been there since the early 1980s. He was tall, thoughtful, careful in the way that the best television journalists are careful, the sort of reporter who checked his facts twice, and then a third time, and then still asked one more question before he went to air. He had won Peabody Awards and Emmy Awards, and the sort of small honours that accumulate over the career of someone who takes journalism seriously. He was, by any conventional measure, a serious man. He was also, by inclination, fascinated by the strange. In 1989, He had done a series of interviews with a young man named Bob Lazar, who claimed to have worked on reverse engineering alien spacecraft at a facility called S4, adjacent to a place called Area 51 in the desert north of Las Vegas. The Lazar interviews had been a bombshell. They had put Area 51 on the map in a way that it had never been before. They had made Knapp famous in certain circles and infamous in others, and had ensured that when strange things happened in the American West, his was one of the first phone numbers that people called. And so, in that same summer that Robert Bigelow was reading about the Sherman Ranch, George Knapp was calling. He was following the story too. He would eventually visit the ranch himself, again and again, becoming the only journalist ever regularly allowed inside. He would write about it, first in a series of articles for an alternative weekly newspaper in Las Vegas, and then, years later, in the book that he and Colm Kelleher would co-author in 2005, Hunt for the Skinwalker. The book came and went in the way that books about strange subjects often come and go. It sold reasonably well. It was reviewed in some places, ignored in others. Most readers of most newspapers, if they knew about Skinwalker Ranch at all, would have known about it from a paragraph or two in the odder corners of the internet. It was not, in 2005, a national story, but it was read. It was read, in particular, by a man named James Lakatsky, who worked at the Defense Intelligence Agency in Washington, D.C. Lakatsky was a physicist, and he had, for reasons that were his own, an interest in exactly the sort of thing the book described. He read Hunt for the Skinwalker, and he was intrigued enough that he picked up the telephone and he called Robert Bigelow, and he asked whether he might come to the ranch. Bigelow said yes. What happened to Lakatsky on his visit to the ranch, no one has ever fully described in public. He has spoken about it obliquely in the years since. He has said that he had, on that visit, an experience. What sort of experience, he has not made entirely clear. But whatever it was, it convinced him, and it convinced Bigelow, that the ranch deserved attention at a higher level than it had so far received. Bigelow, being Bigelow, made a phone call. He was friends with a man named Harry Reid. Reid was, at that time, a United States Senator from Nevada, and not just any senator, but the majority leader of the Senate, the most powerful Democratic member of that body. Reid and Bigelow had known each other for years. They shared an interest in these matters. Reid was, like Bigelow, a native of the Nevada desert, and had, like Bigelow, grown up with the shadow of the Nevada test site on the edge of his childhood. He was not embarrassed by the subject. He thought it deserved study. Reid took the story to another senator, Ted Stevens of Alaska, who had, according to the reporting, some personal experience of his own with an unidentified craft. And then a third, Daniel Inouye of Hawaii, and between the three of them, they inserted quietly into the Department of Defense appropriations a line item for $22 million to fund a study of unidentified aerial phenomena. That study became known over time by a number of names: the Advanced Aerospace Weapons Systems Applications Program, or AAWSAP, in the beginning. Then the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, or AATIP, different acronyms for overlapping efforts. And at the heart of the funding was a contract awarded to a company called Bigelow Aerospace Advanced Space Studies, BAAS, which was, of course, an arm of Robert Bigelow's own organization. And the physical center of the research, the place where much of the observation and investigation was quietly conducted, was Skinwalker Ranch. Think about that for a moment as you settle further into your pillow. A small ranch in the high desert of Utah, purchased for $200,000, became, for a period of 5 years, from 2007 to 2012, the object of a $22 million government inquiry run through the Defense Intelligence Agency at the request of the Majority Leader of the United States Senate. All of this happening in almost complete silence while the rest of the country went about its business. No one at your local grocery store knew. No one on the evening news reported it. It was, in every sense, a hidden operation, tucked inside the vastness of the defense budget, the way an oil deposit lies tucked inside the shale of the Uinta Basin. Quiet, present, waiting. And the results of that inquiry? That, too, is a matter of some dispute. The program produced a 500-page report, sometimes called the 10-month report, which documented UFO sightings from around the world across many decades. The program funded 38 academic papers on subjects at the very edge of physics: warp drive, wormholes, invisibility cloaking, negative mass propulsion, the manipulation of extra dimensions. Papers with titles that read like the chapter headings of a science fiction novel. Those papers, when they were eventually released under Freedom of Information Act requests, would strike some readers as remarkable and others as absurd, and probably both reactions were warranted. But the program's most lasting legacy would be something else. It would be a set of short videos taken by US Navy pilots of objects they could not identify. Videos with strange, simple names: FLIR and Gimbal and Go Fast. Grainy, black and white infrared footage of small oval shapes moving in ways that pilots said they had never seen anything move. Those videos would eventually make their way to the New York Times in December of 2017, and the New York Times would publish them, and for the first time in the history of the American government, a national newspaper of record would report, in plain language, that the Pentagon had been secretly funding a program to investigate unidentified aerial phenomena, and the trail of that program, if you followed it back far enough, would lead you, ultimately, to a ranch in the Uinta Basin, and to a rancher named Sherman, and to a wolf that would not die. Let us take a long breath now. Let us let all of that settle. Let us let the story rest for a moment on the edge of our thoughts, like a light lowering over the horizon, because we have not yet spoken enough about the land itself, and the land in this story is more than a setting. The land is a character. The land is perhaps the most important character of all. Return with me to the basin. Imagine it now, not from above, but from within. You are standing on the ranch. It is late afternoon in the middle of summer. The air is hot but dry, and there is a small wind coming down off the mountains, carrying the scent of high country pines with it. The sagebrush stretches away from you in every direction, silver green, low, immensely patient. There is a stand of cottonwoods along the creek that runs through the property, their leaves rustling with a sound like water. There are outbuildings and fences and old corrals, and the small ranch house set back from the road. Above you, to the west, the mesa rises. It is not a dramatic mesa, as mesas in Utah go. It is a long, low ridge, capped with stone, sparsely dotted with pinyon and juniper. But it is the mesa the Ute grandmothers warned about. It is the ridge where, they said, the curse was placed. Now imagine the day beginning to end. Imagine the sun sliding down behind the western mountains and the shadow of the ridge stretching across the pasture, growing longer and longer until it reaches the porch of the ranch house and then past it into the fields beyond. Imagine the color of the sky deepening from blue to gold to orange to red, and then to a color that is not quite any of those, something more like the inside of a bruise, and then, at last, to the deep purple of high desert twilight. The stars come out slowly here, first one or two, then a handful, then, all at once, 1,000. The Uinta Basin is one of the darkest places still in the lower 48. There is very little light pollution. There are very few towns. The nearest interstate is far away, and so the sky above the ranch, on a clear night, is an ocean of stars stretching from horizon to horizon, uninterrupted, ancient, absolute. If you stand there long enough in the dark and let your eyes adjust, you will begin to see things you did not see at first. The faint band of the Milky Way arching overhead, meteors from time to time falling in bright quick lines, the occasional satellite moving in a steady arc across the sky, and sometimes this is what the ranchers said, and the investigators said, and the scientists said, and the pilots said, sometimes something else. A light that is not quite any of those things. A light that seems to hesitate. A light that seems to move in a way that does not obey the rules that other lights obey. Whether these lights are real, in the way that a satellite is real, or whether they are the product of something in the eyes or the mind of the observer, is a question that has been argued for decades. There are honest, careful, well-trained people on both sides of that argument. But the argument itself, the fact that intelligent, sober adults have found themselves standing in the dark of the Uinta Basin, looking up, wondering, is real. That no one disputes. Let us slow further now. Let us drift into the deeper hours of the night on the ranch. Colm Kelleher, in the years he ran the investigation, would speak sometimes about what it was like to spend a night on the property. There was, he said, a particular quality to the silence. The Uinta Basin is a place where silence, if you are used to city sounds, can feel almost heavy. There are no cars, no distant sirens, no hum of streetlights. There is only, on most nights, the wind. And even the wind, up in the basin, has a particular sound, a low, steady sighing, as though the land itself were breathing very slowly in and out. Kelleher would describe how the observers, working in shifts, would sit for hours in front of banks of monitors, waiting for a movement in the field, waiting for a light on the mesa, waiting for one of the sensors to trip and register something that could later be examined and understood. Most nights, nothing happened. That was the truth of it, the honest, unromantic truth of the investigation. Most nights were long, quiet, uneventful. The scientists drank coffee, they read books, they took turns watching, they talked in low voices about their families, their earlier careers, their reasons for having agreed to come out here to this strange place at all. And then, sometimes, without warning, something would happen. A monitor would flicker, a camera would lose its feed, a sensor down in the pasture would register a movement or a temperature change or a magnetic anomaly, and the observers would sit up straight in their chairs and reach for their radios and try, in the moment, to record what they were seeing. And more often than not, Kelleher would say this with a rueful smile, the record would prove incomplete. The tape would have a gap. The camera would have gone off just as the interesting thing began. The sensor data would show something, but not enough. It was, he would say, as though the phenomenon itself were shy or wary or unwilling to be captured, as though it knew. There is a phrase that gets used sometimes about places like this, trickster phenomena, It is not a scientific phrase, it is more of a folkloric one, but it captures something about the frustration of the research, the idea that whatever was happening at the ranch, if anything was happening at all, was in some sense playing with the investigators, revealing itself just enough to be tantalizing, withdrawing just before the moment of capture, like an animal on the edge of a clearing that looks at you for just long enough to be sure you have seen it, and then vanishes. The investigators on the ranch over the years developed a kind of protocol for this. When something unusual seemed to be happening, they would try not to react. They would try to stay calm. They would try to record without appearing to be trying to record. They would, in a sense, try to trick the trickster. It rarely worked, but it kept them occupied. It gave them a way of not going mad over the long, uneventful nights and the sudden, inexplicable moments. Now let us leave the ranch for a while and think about the wider story of unusual lights in the American sky, because the Uinta Basin was not the only place. In the years after the Second World War, a whole new folklore had grown up in the United States around lights in the sky. It began, most people would say, in the summer of 1947 with a private pilot named Kenneth Arnold, who reported seeing 9 strange craft moving at high speed near Mount Rainier in Washington state. Arnold described them as skipping across the sky the way, he said, a saucer would skip across water. The phrase flying saucer entered the language that week and never left it. A few weeks after Arnold's sighting, in July of 1947, something crashed on a ranch outside of Roswell, New Mexico. The local airbase issued a press release saying they had recovered a flying disc. The next day they retracted it and said it had been a weather balloon. Whichever explanation was correct, the story stuck. Roswell became a name, and for the next 70 years, in one form or another, some portion of the American public and some portion of the American government would return again and again to the question of what, if anything, was moving in the American sky. The Uinta Basin, sitting where it does, between the Rockies and the deserts of the Great Basin, at high elevation, with dark skies, would become, in the years after the war, one of the country's persistent hotspots, not the most famous. Roswell was more famous. Groom Lake, the salt flat in Nevada that became known as Area 51, was more famous. But the Uinta Basin was, in the quiet, steady way of these things, one of the places where the sightings simply did not stop. Year after year, decade after decade, the reports accumulated. Frank Salisbury, the Utah scientist, collected many of them into a book. Joe Jr. Hicks, a school teacher and part-time investigator in the basin, collected many more. When you read those books, you get a sense of a place that has, quietly, been the subject of a very long and very unresolved conversation with the sky. And now let us go back to Skinwalker Ranch, and let us think about who Bigelow was again, and about what he did with the ranch, and about how the story continued to move. For 20 years, from 1996 until 2016, Robert Bigelow owned the ranch. The scientific investigations of the early years under NIDS wound down eventually. Bigelow disbanded that organization in 2004, but he kept the ranch. He kept the security fences. He kept the no trespassing signs. And when, in 2007, the Pentagon money began to flow through his aerospace company, the ranch quietly became one of the central sites of the government-funded investigation. Meanwhile, Bigelow was pursuing his other great project. He had founded Bigelow Aerospace in 1998, and he had licensed from NASA a technology that had been developed and then abandoned by the space agency in the 1990s, a design for inflatable, expandable space habitats. modules that could be launched compact and then expanded once in orbit, providing much more usable volume than traditional rigid modules. Bigelow believed in the technology. He believed there was a commercial market for it. He believed, in his broader vision, that humans belonged in space, not just as astronauts on brief scientific missions, but as workers and researchers, and eventually, perhaps, as ordinary travelers staying in hotels in low Earth orbit. Bigelow invested some $250 million of his own money into that vision over the years. He launched 2 experimental modules, Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, in 2006 and 2007 aboard converted Russian ballistic missiles from a launch site in Orenburg Oblast. They inflated as planned, deployed their solar arrays, and orbited the Earth for years afterward. In 2016, an expanded module called BEAM, the Bigelow Expandable Activity Module, was attached to the International Space Station, and it is still there today, or was, at the last accounting. There is something poetic, I think, about the 2 halves of Bigelow's life running in parallel. On one hand, the man was investing his fortune in trying to open up the volume of near-Earth space to human habitation. He was, in the most literal sense, trying to give humanity more room to live. On the other hand, he was investing in trying to understand what, if anything, was moving through that same volume of space, unnoticed and unclaimed, on nights when no one but a rancher in Utah was watching. Both were, in their way, projects of expansion. Both were, in their way, projects of hope. Bigelow was interviewed over the years by a number of reporters on both subjects. He was not shy about his beliefs. In 2017, he told a reporter for the New York Times, without hesitation, that he was absolutely convinced that extraterrestrial life existed and that extraterrestrials had visited Earth. He did not say how he knew. He did not offer evidence. He simply, calmly, stated his view. And then he went back to the business of building space stations. In the summer of 2016, Bigelow sold Skinwalker Ranch. He had owned it for 20 years. He had, by his own accounts, seen and heard enough to leave him convinced that something was happening there, but he had also grown, perhaps, tired of the effort of keeping the property. The buyer was a real estate company called Adamantium Real Estate, a Delaware LLC based in Salt Lake City. The purchase price was reported at around $500,000, though later reports would put it higher. For a long time, the ownership was a secret. Adamantium was a shell. The name behind the shell was not, at first, disclosed. Then, in March of 2020, the owner came forward. His name was Brandon Fugel. Fugel was and is a Utah real estate developer, born in Pleasant Grove in 1973. He had grown up in a Latter-day Saint household. He had served, in his young adulthood, a 2-year mission in Hawaii. He had come home and gone into commercial real estate and had built, over the years, one of the most successful real estate operations in the state. By the time he bought the ranch, he was the chairman of the Utah office of Colliers International, and he was, by the standards of his industry, a very wealthy man. He also owned a helicopter. He also owned, at one point or another, Ferraris and Lamborghinis and Porsches. He was, on paper, a very different sort of person from Robert Bigelow, more visibly, more publicly, a man of the world. But Fugel had, like Bigelow before him, an interest in the strange, and when the opportunity came in 2016 to purchase the ranch, he took it. He said later in interviews that he had gone to the ranch himself in the months after the purchase and had seen, with his own eyes, in the company of others, a silver-grey disc-like object moving above the mesa. Whatever else might be said about Fugal, he did not, after that, treat the ranch as a joke. He did the opposite. He locked it down. He barricaded the roads leading to it. He posted armed guards. He put cameras on every fence post. He hired a full-time security team headed by his childhood friend from that mission in Hawaii, Bryant Arnold, and he began quietly to install instrumentation, ground-penetrating radar, radiation detectors, high-resolution cameras, sensors of many kinds. He treated the ranch as a laboratory, one that was privately owned, privately funded, and privately monitored, but a laboratory nonetheless. And then, in 2020, just as he was disclosing his ownership publicly, a television series about the ranch premiered on the History Channel. It was called The Secret of Skinwalker Ranch, and it was produced by the same company that had produced The Curse of Oak Island, a long-running series about a treasure hunt in Nova Scotia. The show followed Fugal and an aerospace engineer named Travis Taylor and a small team of researchers as they investigated the ranch on camera. It aired for one season, then another, and then another, and by 2026 it had run for 7 seasons, one of the most watched series on the History Channel. The show did not solve the mystery. Television shows rarely do, but it made the ranch famous. It made it, in fact, one of the most famous pieces of private property in the United States, alongside places like Skywalker Ranch in California and Neverland Ranch in the same state, though the fame of Skinwalker Ranch was of a different kind, quieter, stranger, more persistent. Millions of viewers, week after week, tuned in to watch Fugal and Taylor lower instruments into a mysterious pit near the mesa, or fly drones above the property, or interview witnesses who had lived or worked at the ranch over the decades. The show was criticized by science writers as lacking rigor. It was praised by fans as bringing to light a mystery that had been ignored for too long. Both criticisms and praise were probably fair in their own ways. The show was, above all, a phenomenon. And it turned Skinwalker Ranch into something no place quite like it had ever been before, a paranormal site that was also a fully monitored, fully televised, fully instrumented, ongoing scientific investigation broadcast to a national audience. Let us breathe here for a moment. Let us settle into the rhythm of what we've been told. Because the story of Skinwalker Ranch, if you follow it patiently from beginning to end, is not really a story about UFOs, or about skinwalkers, or about cattle mutilations, or about any single strange thing. It is a story about attention. It is a story about what happens when a place, for whatever reasons, begins to command the attention of one person, and then another, until eventually it commands the attention of an entire government and an entire nation. The ranch itself has not changed much in the years since Terry and Gwen Sherman first drove up to it in 1994. The land is the same, the sagebrush is the same, the mesa is the same. The Ute grandmothers still know what their grandmothers knew, and they still say the same things about that ridge. The lights, if there are lights, still come out at night, or perhaps they do not. The debate continues. What has changed is only the amount of watching. What has changed is the sheer volume of eyes turned patiently toward that particular 512 acres of Utah. There is something about that, I think, that is worth sitting with as we drift toward the deeper hours of the night. Something about the way a place, once it becomes the object of attention, can amplify that attention until it seems almost to hum with meaning, Whether or not there is anything actually strange happening at Skinwalker Ranch, it is now undeniably one of the most watched places in the country. And things that are watched that closely, that patiently, for that long, those things become strange, whether they were strange to begin with or not. Let us go back now to the beginning. Let us go back to the Utes. The Utes have been in this country for a very long time, longer than we can fully account for. Their language, the Colorado River Numic dialect, comes from a family of languages called Uto-Aztecan, which stretches all the way from the Great Basin of North America down through the deserts of Mexico to the Central Plateau, where it eventually gave rise to Nahuatl, the language of the Aztecs. Linguists believe that the Uto-Aztecan language family originated somewhere near the border of present-day Nevada and California thousands of years ago, and spread outward from there in slow migrations that unfolded over many centuries. By the year 1300, ancestral Utes were living in what is now southwestern Colorado and southeastern Utah. They lived as hunter-gatherers. They followed the game seasonally. They spent summers in high mountain meadows and winters in sheltered river valleys. They gathered pine nuts and berries and roots and yampa, the wild carrot-like plant that gave its name to the Yampa River. They hunted deer and elk and antelope and later buffalo. They lived, for the most part, in extended family groups of 20 to 100 people, and they came together in larger gatherings from time to trade, to intermarry, and to conduct their ceremonies. Their most important ceremonies were the bear dance, held each spring, and the sun dance, held each summer. The bear dance marked the emergence of the bear from its winter hibernation, and it was also, traditionally, a time when young Utes could court one another. The sun dance was a longer ceremony involving fasting and purification, and it renewed the connection between the people and the land, and between the people and the powers that lay behind the land. The Utes had names for the places they knew. Pikes Peak in Colorado they called Tavakiev, the Sun Mountain. The mineral springs at Manitou Springs were sacred to them and to other tribes as well, and they came each year to spend winters there and to share, as one account put it, in the gifts of the waters without worry of conflict. The high parks of the Central Rockies, North Park, Middle Park, were favoured hunting grounds. The San Luis Valley was a place of gathering, and in northeastern Utah, the basin we now call the Uinta Basin was one of their home territories. The Winter Band, from whom the name derives, spent much of their year in that basin. They knew every spring, they knew every drainage, they knew, in the way that indigenous peoples always know, the small local truths of the land, where the deer bedded down, where the horses would find grass in a dry summer, where the willows grew thick, where the currents in the river ran deepest. They also knew, in that same way, the places that were not to be travelled. Every landscape, if you live in it long enough, has such places. Places where the terrain is dangerous, places where the game is scarce, places where, according to the stories passed down, something bad happened once, long ago, and never quite went away. That low ridge above the ranch, where we started, was one of those places. It was avoided. It was mentioned only briefly, in low voices, when it was mentioned at all. When the first Spanish explorers came through the region in the 1770s on the Dominguez Escalante expedition, they encountered the Utes and traded with them, and they left, and they did not, at that time, disturb very much. The Utes had already by then acquired horses, from other tribes farther south who had acquired them from the Spanish colonies of New Mexico. The Ute culture in that century was transforming, becoming more mobile, more mounted, more capable of ranging over long distances. Some Utes drifted eastward and in time became the Comanches, a separate people, a plains people, one of the great horse cultures of North America. Others stayed close to the mountains and remained Utes and continued to know the basin as home. The Great Disruption came, as it came almost everywhere else in the American West, with the arrival of white settlers. In 1847, the first Mormon pioneers arrived in the Salt Lake Valley, having crossed the plains on their long exodus from Missouri and Illinois. They came looking for a promised land, and they found it in the deserts of Utah, and they began, in the years that followed, to expand their settlements southward and outward. As they did, they came into contact with the Utes, and the contact was, in many cases, painful for both peoples. There were wars. The Walker War in the 1850s, named for a Ute chief called Walkara, who tried to resist the encroachment on his people's lands. The Black Hawk War in the 1860s and early 1870s, named for another Ute leader, Black Hawk, the son of a chief called San Pitch. There were treaties, some kept and many broken. There was the steady, grinding process by which the Utes lost, decade by decade, most of their traditional territory. In 1861, at the urging of Brigham Young, President Abraham Lincoln signed an executive order setting aside the Uinta River Valley as a reservation for the Utes of Utah Territory. In 1865, another act extinguished Ute title to any land in Utah outside that reservation. The Utes were removed onto the reservation, sometimes forcibly, and there they were expected to farm in a country that was not well suited to their agriculture, and to send their children to boarding schools, and to give up their horses, and to become, in the eyes of the government, something other than what they were. The Colorado Utes, farther east, went through a similar process. In 1868, another treaty put them on a reservation in the western part of that state. In 1879, an incident called the Meeker Affair, in which a federal Indian agent named Nathan Meeker was killed by White River Utes, led to the loss of most of the remaining Ute land in Colorado. By the 1880s, the Utes of Colorado and Utah had been reduced to a fraction of their former territory and confined for the most part to a few relatively small reservations. And so, when the 20th century arrived, the Utes were still on the land, but they no longer moved across it in the way they once had. They no longer summered in the high country and wintered in the valleys. They no longer travelled to Manitou Springs, or to Pikes Peak, or to the great gathering places of their older world. They lived, for the most part, on their reservations, and they carried, in their languages and their stories and their ceremonies, the memory of what had been. But they still knew the ridge above what would one day be called Skinwalker Ranch. They still knew what their grandmothers had told them. And when, in the 1990s, the first newspaper reporters began to call them, asking about the strange stories coming from the Sherman Ranch, some of the Utes agreed to speak, and others did not. The ones who spoke said what their grandmothers had told them. They said the ridge was cursed. They said it had been cursed by the Navajo long ago, during one of the old wars between the two peoples. They said they had never gone up there. They said they never would. That is a story I want us to sit with for a moment. Not because it explains anything. It does not explain anything, but because it is, in its way, a very old kind of story, it is the story of a place that has been marked by memory. It is the story of a piece of land that has been held, for generations, in the mind of a people, as a place where you do not go. Every landscape has such places, if you look. Every landscape carries, in the collective memory of the people who have lived on it longest, a map of caution laid over the map of use. There are places you visit, and there are places you cross to get somewhere else, and there are places you leave alone. The reasons may be practical, bears, avalanches, sinking mud, or they may be less practical, harder to articulate. Something happened here once. Something is not right here. Do not go. The Utes, in speaking of the ridge above the ranch, were speaking in that older mode. They were mapping caution onto land. Whether or not any modern scientist would call their warnings correct, they were, in the language of their own tradition, doing what their ancestors had done in every generation. They were remembering a place. They were saying its name softly, so as not to call to it. They were teaching the next generation to give it a wide berth. And then, in 1994, a family from outside the basin bought that piece of land. They did not know the warnings, or they knew them and did not credit them, and they moved in, and they began to work the land in the way that ranchers work land, and things began, according to them, to happen. Whether the things that happened were caused by the land, or by the family, or by some combination of the two, or by nothing at all except imagination and coincidence, is a question that no one, in the years since, has been able to answer. But the story of the warnings, and the story of the family, and the story of the strange events, and the story of the billionaire, and the story of the scientists, and the story of the senator, and the story of the $22 million, and the story of the Navy videos, all of those stories in the end come back to the same piece of ground, the same 512 acres in the high desert of northeastern Utah, the same low ridge in the shadow of the same evening sun. Let us breathe now, and let us drift a little deeper. Let us think about what a night on the ranch might actually feel like if we were there, not on television, not through the lens of a reporter, just there, quietly, as ourselves. The road to the ranch is a dirt road. It runs off of the highway, and it winds through the sagebrush, and it comes, eventually, to a gate. The gate is closed. There are signs. There are cameras mounted on the fence posts, small dark eyes catching the last of the daylight. If you were a stranger, you would not get past the gate. But we are not strangers in our imagining. We are, in the safety of our own thoughts, allowed to pass. Beyond the gate, the road continues. It curves past the outbuildings, past the small ranch house, and out into the pasture. If you stand near the house, you can see to the west the long, low mesa rising above the property. If you turn to the east, you can see the pasture stretching away toward the creek, and beyond the creek, toward the reservation. To the south, there is a road that eventually connects to the small town of Roosevelt and to the highway that runs across the basin. To the north, there is more open country and, in the distance, the shoulders of the Uinta Mountains. The house is not large. It has been added to over the years, but it retains the shape of a mid-century ranch house, low, rectangular, with a small porch and a screen door that catches the wind. If you were to stand on that porch at dusk, you would hear first the wind. Then, if you were patient, you would hear the small sounds of the land, a meadowlark calling from a fence post, the distant lowing of cattle, the rustle of leaves in the cottonwoods along the creek, a dog barking somewhere far away on another property, its sound thinned by the distance. You would smell the sage. You would smell, faintly, the smoke of a stovepipe from somewhere down the road. You would smell, perhaps, the sweet, slightly medicinal scent of juniper. You would smell dust. If you stayed on the porch as the light faded, you would see the sky do what the desert sky does at that hour. You would see the color of the world change, not once, but many times. The mesa would darken first, its outline sharpening against the reddening sky behind it. The pasture would turn from green to gold to grey. The creek, when you could still see it, would flash from silver to black. The stars would begin one by one, and then in constellations, and then in whole vast fields, to fill the sky above you. And you would stand there, and you would listen, and you would try to imagine what it would be like to spend not one night here, but 100 nights, or 1,000 nights, to grow so familiar with this land that you could name every rustle of every leaf and know when a sound belonged and when it did not. The people who have spent the most time on the ranch, the Shermans in their 18 months, and Colum Kelleher in his years of investigation, and the security team under Brandon Fugel, have spoken over the years about what it is like to live with the possibility that something might happen at any moment. They have said that it changes you, it sharpens your attention, it teaches you to notice the smallest details. It also, they have said, tires you. There is a certain kind of exhaustion that comes from being on watch for a very long time, from being always ready for something that only rarely appears. Terry Sherman, in his interviews, described feeling, by the end of the 18 months, worn down. Not frightened, exactly, though he had been frightened too at times. Just tired. Tired of not sleeping well. Tired of watching the pasture from the window at 3 a.m. Tired of hearing his dogs bark at nothing, or at something he could not see. When he and Gwen decided in the end to sell the ranch, they were making the decision that many people, over the years, have made in similar situations. They were choosing to walk away from a place that had asked too much of them. Robert Bigelow, when he heard the story, made a different choice. He decided to walk toward the place, and the scientists who came after him made the same choice. Each of them, in their own way, agreed to place themselves in the middle of the mystery for a time and to see what they could learn. Let us drift for a while now, and let us think about the shape of the American West in general, because Skinwalker Ranch is, in some sense, a very Western story, and the West itself carries a great deal of the strangeness of the world in its long open spaces. Imagine, if you would, driving across the West at night. Imagine the long empty stretches of highway that connect the small towns of Utah and Nevada and Wyoming and Idaho and Montana. Imagine the way the mountains rise and fall on the horizon, the way the pinyon and juniper give way to sagebrush, and the sagebrush gives way to salt flats, and the salt flats give way sometimes to nothing at all, to a wide, bright expanse of pale earth that stretches for miles. The West, in the parts of it that have not been paved over, is one of the emptiest places in the industrialized world. There are counties in Nevada larger than some European countries, with populations of a few thousand people. There are stretches of road where you can drive for an hour without passing another car. There are nights when the sky above you, if you stop and get out of your vehicle, is so full of stars that you can barely make sense of it. It is not a coincidence, I think, that so many of the strange stories of the American 20th century have come out of that country. The land encourages them. The land makes room for them. When the horizon is very far away and the sky is very large and the towns are very few, things that would seem improbable elsewhere begin to seem possible. Lights in the sky that, in a crowded eastern suburb, would be attributed to a plane or a helicopter in the wide, dark spaces of the West become, sometimes, something else. Or perhaps not something else. Perhaps just the same thing, seen with less context. But the effect is the same. The West, at night, is a country where the possibilities of the strange are simply larger than they are elsewhere. Skinwalker Ranch sits in the middle of that country, and the story of Skinwalker Ranch is, in many ways, a story of the West. It is a story of a small piece of land in a big empty basin. It is a story of ranchers and reporters and billionaires and government officials, all of them wandering over the decades into a shared conversation about what might be moving in the sky and on the ground and beneath the surface of the earth. It is a story that could not, quite, have happened anywhere else. Let us return now to the specifics. Let us think about the cattle, because the cattle, more than the lights, and more even than the skinwalkers, are the thread that runs through so much of this story. Cattle mutilations, as I mentioned earlier, are not unique to the Uinta Basin. They are, in fact, a widespread phenomenon that has been reported in various forms across the western United States and in parts of South America, and even on occasion in Europe. They have been reported since the 1960s. They have been investigated by state agencies, by the FBI, by the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. They have produced entire libraries of books and articles and speculation, and they remain, in many respects, unresolved. The pattern is simple to describe. A rancher goes out to check the herd. He finds an animal dead, sometimes recently, sometimes not. He looks at the body, and he sees that certain parts have been removed: an ear, an eye, the tongue, the reproductive organs, the anus and rectum, sometimes more. Sometimes the removal appears clean, as though performed with a sharp instrument. Sometimes there is no blood, or very little. Sometimes the animal is drained. Sometimes the surrounding ground shows no tracks, no coyote prints, no vulture feathers, no signs of the ordinary scavengers who would be expected to gather at a carcass. The rancher reports it. Sometimes the sheriff comes out. Sometimes a veterinarian is called. Sometimes samples are taken to a laboratory. And sometimes, often actually, the laboratory reports back with an explanation that satisfies no one. Predation, natural causes, post-mortem changes. The rancher shakes his head. The sheriff shrugs. The animal goes into the ground, and the story enters the local folklore of the county, another entry in a long ledger of unexplained losses. Some of these deaths, without any doubt, are ordinary. Predation and scavenging and post-mortem bloat can produce results that look, to an untrained eye, more mysterious than they are. Blowflies can enter through the mouth and the anus because those are the openings where the skin is thinnest. Scavengers can remove soft tissues in a way that looks precise but is not. Skin can split along straight lines as an animal bloats and then dries, producing what look like knife cuts. These things are all true, and they explain many of the cases, but not all. Some cases over the years have shown features that resist even the most patient natural explanation. Cattle with tissues that show unusually high or low levels of vitamins or minerals. Cattle with the presence, in their tissues, of chemicals not normally found in animals. cattle whose blood appears not to have clotted properly even days after death, cattle whose carcasses are avoided by scavengers as though something in the flesh has repelled them. One of the more interesting theories to emerge over the years has been that some of the cases represent a covert, unacknowledged program of monitoring, perhaps by the US government, perhaps by others, of the spread of infectious diseases in cattle. Bovine spongiform encephalopathy, the so-called mad cow disease, was of great concern to epidemiologists in the late 20th century. So was scrapie, the related disease in sheep. And a colleague of Robert Bigelow's, Colm Kelleher, who had been trained as a biochemist and who had studied these things, argued, in a book he later wrote, that the pattern of tissue removal in some cattle mutilations was strikingly similar to the pattern that wildlife disease researchers use when they sample animals for prion diseases. He argued that the use of helicopters, which was sometimes reported in the vicinity of mutilations, was consistent with wildlife survey techniques. He argued that the use of formaldehyde, which was sometimes detected in the surrounding grass, was consistent with sample preservation. It is, in some ways, a mundane explanation. It replaces alien beings and satanic cults with a much more familiar image, a helicopter-borne veterinary team doing its work at night without notifying local ranchers, because to do so would cause panic. But mundane explanations for these sorts of stories have a tendency to feel unsatisfying. Ranchers who have lost cattle in mysterious ways do not, in general, feel comforted by the idea that a government program was involved. In some cases, they feel less comforted, not more. And so the story continues, and the ledger continues, and the mystery persists. At Skinwalker Ranch, in the years the Shermans lived there, and in the years after, some cattle deaths were reported. Not many, if you compare them to the totals of a full working ranch, but enough to become part of the story, enough to be photographed and described and included in the reports that Colm Kelleher and his team eventually compiled. Whether those particular cases were connected to the wider phenomenon, or to the specific strangeness of the ranch, or to some ordinary combination of predators and post-mortem changes, I cannot tell you. But they were part of what convinced Robert Bigelow in 1996 that the ranch was worth buying, and they were part of the ledger that has kept the story alive in the years since. Let us breathe now, let us slow down, and let the details drift a little, because we are approaching the middle of our long night together, and the story we are telling is, in the end, a slow one. It is not a story of sudden revelations. It is not a story that ends with a great answer. It is a story that ends, if it ends at all, with a great deal of quiet, with the wind in the cottonwoods, with the stars over the basin, with the long low ridge unchanged, unmoved, patient as it has always been. Let us stay with that quiet for a little while. Imagine, if you will, that you are lying now in your own bed, and beyond your window, somewhere very far away, the wind is moving across a ranch in Utah. It is late. The moon is high, or the moon is low, or perhaps there is no moon at all. Just the vast field of stars above the mesa, above the pasture, above the sleeping herd of cattle in the far corner of the property. There are lights on in the house. There are cameras humming quietly on their poles. There are security guards drinking coffee, watching monitors, waiting for something that may or may not come. There is a man named Brandon Fugel, hundreds of miles away, at home in a Utah suburb, asleep himself, perhaps, or perhaps still awake, checking, one last time, that everything on the ranch is quiet. There is a man named Robert Bigelow in Las Vegas, retired now from many of his old pursuits, thinking of other things. There are scientists, long since dispersed from the ranch, going about their lives in university towns and government laboratories, remembering, from time to time, the strange years they spent in the trailers of the Uinta Basin. And there is the ranch itself. There is the land. There is the ridge. The ridge does not know that it is watched, or perhaps it does. That, of course, is the question at the heart of the whole story, whether the ridge knows, whether the ranch knows, whether there is anything on that piece of ground that has the kind of attention that could know or not know. That question has been asked, in one form or another, by every person who has spent any real time on the property, and no one has answered it definitively in either direction. But whether or not the ridge knows, the ridge remains. It has been there for millions of years. It was there when the great inland sea receded and the sediment of the lake bed hardened into shale. It was there when the Colorado Plateau began to rise in the great slow uplift that gave the region its high dry character. It was there when the Fremont people, ancestors of some of the modern Puebloan tribes, moved across the region, growing corn and painting figures on the canyon walls. It was there when the Utes came, and when the Utes learned to avoid it. It was there when Father Escalante's expedition passed through in the fall of 1776 on their long looping journey through the western territories that would one day be Utah and Colorado. It was there when the fur trappers came in the 1820s and 30s, Etienne Provost and François Leclerc and Antoine Robidoux, trading with the Utes for beaver pelts along the streams of the basin. It was there when the Mormon settlers began, in the middle of the 19th century, to push into the basin from the west, and when the reservation was established in 1861, and when the ranch itself was homesteaded in the early years of the 20th century. It has watched all of this, if watching is the word. It has stood there, low and long, above the ranch that would one day bear its shadow. Let us breathe together, and let us think of the ridge as we would think of any old and quiet thing, as we would think of an old mountain, or an old lake, or an old forest, not as something threatening, not as something to be feared, just as something very, very old and very, very patient, doing what old and patient things do, which is to remain where they are, and to be, and to wait. Let us drift now deeper into our night. Let us think again about George Knapp, the reporter in Las Vegas, who did not stop watching this story. He is, in some ways, the character in this whole telling who I find most interesting, because Knapp was not a believer exactly. He was not a skeptic either. He was a reporter. He was someone whose job it was to look at things and to describe them as clearly as he could, without either believing them or refusing to believe them. And he stayed with this story decade after decade in a way that no other journalist did. He was born in Woodbury, New Jersey, and he grew up in Northern California, and he graduated from a high school in Stockton, where he had been the senior class president. He earned a bachelor's degree at the University of West Georgia and a master's at the University of the Pacific in a field called communication. He taught debate. He moved to Las Vegas in 1979, driving a taxi at first, because that was the work available to him. He was hired as an intern at a local television station, and then, in 1981, as a reporter at KLAS. And there he stayed, through the 80s, through the 90s, through the 2000s and the 2010s, through the interviews with Bob Lazar and the trips to the ranch, and the book with Colm Kelleher, and the eventual coming out of the Pentagon UFO program on the front page of the New York Times. He won awards, Emmys and Peabodys and Edward R. Murrow Awards. He anchored the news. He hosted a show called Street Talk. He was, by any conventional measure, a highly successful local journalist in a mid-sized market, a man who might have had, if he had wanted it, a career on national television. But he stayed in Las Vegas, and he stayed on the strange stories. He hosted, in his off hours, episodes of a nationally syndicated late-night talk radio program called Coast to Coast AM, in which subjects like UFOs and the paranormal were discussed for hours at a time on the airwaves of hundreds of stations across the country. He co-hosted, later in his career, a podcast called Weaponized about UFOs and government secrecy with another investigator named Jeremy Corbell. He attended congressional hearings on the subject in Washington, D.C. in the 2020s. He never stopped following the trail. There is a phrase that gets used sometimes about Knapp. He has been called by a magazine writer the John the Baptist of the UFO movement. It is a striking phrase. It refers, of course, to the biblical figure who prepared the way for someone larger to follow. It suggests that Knapp, in his patient, decades-long reporting on these stories, was preparing the ground for something. Whether that something has arrived yet, or whether it ever will, is, I suppose, a matter of opinion. But the phrase captures, I think, the essential character of what Knapp did. He kept the story alive when almost no one else in mainstream journalism was willing to touch it. He kept asking questions. He kept knocking on doors. And when, in December of 2017, the story broke into the New York Times and the Washington Post and Politico all in the same week, Knapp was one of the people who had made that possible. I mention Knapp not because he is a hero. Heroism is not really the right frame, but because the story of Skinwalker Ranch and the wider story it belongs to cannot really be told without him. He is, in a sense, the connective tissue. He is the person who over and over drove out to the ranch and knocked on the door and asked the next question. Without him, the Sherman story might have died in a small newspaper in 1996. Without him, Bigelow might not have bought the ranch. Without him, the book with Kelleher might never have been written. Without the book, Lakatsky might never have visited. Without Lakatsky, the $22 million might never have been appropriated. Without the $22 million, the Navy videos might never have been released.
That is how a story travels. It travels through people. It travels through the ones who will not stop asking, "Let us breathe now, and let us drift a little further. Let us think about what it means for a place to be watched," because that is ultimately what Skinwalker Ranch has become. It has become one of the most watched places in the country. It is watched by cameras on the fence posts, and by the security team on site, and by the researchers who visit under contract with Brandon Fugel, and by the millions of television viewers who tune in to the History Channel each week. It is watched by scientists who study fringe subjects, and by skeptics who study the scientists. It is watched by government officials who no longer publicly acknowledge that they watch it, and by government officials who have publicly acknowledged their earlier interest and are now retired. It is watched by the Utes at a distance, in the way that they have always watched it. It is watched by the ridge itself, if the ridge watches, or by whatever, if anything, is on the ridge. That is a strange kind of watching. It is a watching that has, over time, changed the very nature of the thing being watched. Skinwalker Ranch in 1994 was just a ranch. Skinwalker Ranch in 2026 is not just a ranch anymore. It is a symbol. It is a franchise. It is a legal trademark. It has been registered with the United States Patent and Trademark Office and licensed for merchandise, for cups and mugs and shirts and hats. It has become, in a sense, an economy. None of this proves anything about whether anything real is happening on the property. The ranch could be at once an economy, a franchise, a trademark, and the site of genuine strangeness, or it could be at once an economy, a franchise, a trademark, and nothing more than an ordinary piece of land onto which many decades of story have been projected. Both are possible. Both, in fact, have been argued. But whichever is true, or whichever combination of both is true, the ranch has done something remarkable in the years since Terry Sherman first walked out into that pasture and saw the wolf that would not fall. It has drawn and held an enormous amount of human attention. It has become one of the great sights of the modern American strange. It has become, in its way, a place, not just a piece of land, but a place, in the older sense, a place that has meaning, a place that people know about, a place that people carry in their thoughts, whether or not they have ever seen it. Let us drift further now. Let us think of ourselves as lying in a small guest cabin on the ranch, imagined, for the length of this story. It is very late. The cameras hum. The wind moves in the cottonwoods. The stars turn slowly overhead. Somewhere, on the ridge, if there is anything on the ridge, it is doing whatever it does, unhurried, patient. Somewhere, in the pasture, a cow shifts in its sleep. Somewhere, in the reservation to the east, a Ute grandmother, if she is still awake, is not looking toward the ridge. She has never looked toward the ridge. She will not look toward it tonight. The world is very quiet. The world is very old. The world holds its secrets close, and it always has. Let us think for a moment about the wider question that Skinwalker Ranch and the whole conversation around it ultimately brings us to. Not the question of whether one specific piece of Utah land is haunted, or watched, or blessed, or cursed. The bigger question behind that one, the question of what, if anything, is moving in our world that we do not yet understand. For most of human history, that question was assumed to have many answers. Every culture had its own version. Every landscape had its own inhabitants, spirits of place, ancestors, powers, presences. The world was full in the way that the world was described. It was not empty. It was not silent. It was populated by beings and forces that could be honored, propitiated, avoided, or approached. In the modern West, over the last several hundred years, we have told ourselves a different story. We have told ourselves that the world is largely empty of such beings. We have said that the strange stories of older peoples and older cultures and older times were the products of ignorance or superstition or the workings of an insufficiently developed science. We have said that when we finish our science, we will find that the world is, in fact, just what we thought it was, matter and energy, and nothing more. That is a story. It has served us well in many ways. It has produced the modern world with all its benefits and all its costs. But it is, ultimately, a story, and stories can change. And when a story starts to develop cracks, when Navy pilots begin to see objects they cannot identify, when ranchers begin to lose cattle in ways they cannot explain, when senators begin to spend $22 million quietly to investigate matters that they, publicly, would not discuss, the story begins, gently, to shift. Whether it will shift far, I do not know. Whether the strange stories of the 21st century will one day be understood as extraordinary phenomena, worthy of new sciences, or as ordinary phenomena misperceived, is not something anyone can tell you yet, but the story is, at the very least, in motion. And Skinwalker Ranch, whether it is a genuine mystery or a great collective act of imagination, has been one of the sites where that motion has been most visible. Let us breathe together. Let us feel our breath coming in and going out, slow, quiet. Let us imagine the ranch at its most peaceful. It is very late now. In our imagination we are still on that porch, or in that guest cabin, or on the pasture, wrapped in a blanket looking up. The sky is enormous. There is no sound but the wind. There are no lights on the ridge. There is nothing crossing the field. There is only the great slow turn of the stars and the low hills and the sagebrush around us, silver in the starlight. We do not have to solve the mystery tonight. We do not have to know one way or the other whether anything strange has ever happened here. We only have to lie still and to breathe and to allow the great old land to hold us as it has held everyone who has come to it for however long they have stayed. The Ute grandmothers said, "Do not go up on the ridge. That is fair. We are not going up on the ridge. We are staying down here in the pasture where the ground is soft and the air is cool and the stars are enough." Let us think now more slowly of a few of the smaller details, of the cottonwoods along the creek. Cottonwoods are the trees of water in the American West. Where there are cottonwoods, there is water, close, under the ground, even if not on the surface. The cottonwoods on the ranch in the summer catch the wind with a sound like a soft rain. In the fall, their leaves turn a pale, luminous yellow and drift down onto the ground in wide layers. In the winter, they stand bare, their branches sharp against the sky. In the spring, they bud, and the buds smell faintly resinous and sweet, and if you break one open and rub it between your fingers, the scent stays with you for hours. The creek. The creek moves slowly most of the year, and it is quiet, and it is clear enough that you can see the stones on the bottom. It carries water from the mountains down toward the Duchesne River, and from the Duchesne into the Green, and from the Green into the Colorado, and from the Colorado ultimately down into the Gulf of California, though almost none of it, in most years, actually makes it that far anymore, because so much has been drawn off along the way for the fields and cities of the American Southwest. But the creek on the ranch does not know that. It moves as it has always moved, quietly, unhurried, on its long way to a sea it will never see. The pasture. The pasture has been grazed in one way or another for over a century. Cattle have moved across it, and horses, and before them the deer and antelope that the Utes hunted, and before them the buffalo that ranged this far west in the older centuries. It has been walked on by people speaking many different languages. It has been walked on by children, and by grandmothers, and by young men with dogs, and by scientists with clipboards, and by ranchers with rifles. It remembers, if pastures remember, all of them. The ridge. The ridge is quiet. The ridge is always quiet, in the way that ridges are. The wind. The wind moves down out of the mountains, from the north and west most nights. It comes gently in the summer and hard in the winter. It carries, in every season, the scents of the country it has passed through: snow, pine, sage, juniper, dust, sometimes rain, sometimes smoke. The stars are unchanged. Let us breathe. Let us think one more time about the story we have told, and about how we might hold it gently as we drift towards sleep. We have told the story of a place, a 512-acre piece of land in the high desert of northeastern Utah, a ranch with a low ridge above it that has been the subject of a particular kind of attention for the last 3 decades. We have told the story of the people who lived there before that attention began, the Myers family quietly for 60 years, and of the Ute people
who lived in the wider basin for centuries and who kept, in their older knowledge, a memory of that ridge as a place to be avoided. We have told the story of the family who arrived in 1994 and who left in 1996 after 18 months of what they described as strange experiences, a wolf that would not fall to a bullet, cattle that died in ways they could not understand, lights that moved across the property in the night, and a sense everywhere that they were being watched from the ridge. We have told the story of the billionaire Robert Bigelow, who read about them in a newspaper, and who bought the ranch, and who brought his scientists to it, and who invested years and money in the effort to understand it. We have told the story of the reporter George Knapp, who kept asking questions decade after decade, and of the book that he and Colm Kelleher wrote in 2005, and of the Pentagon official who read that book and who visited the ranch and who had an experience there and who told the friends of the senator from Nevada about it. We have told the story of the $22 million that resulted, hidden inside the defense budget, and of the program that ran for 5 years in silence, and of the videos that eventually leaked, and of the New York Times article in December of 2017 that finally brought the whole quiet operation into the public light. We have told the story of the new owner, Brandon Fugel, who bought the ranch in 2016 and who announced his ownership in 2020 and who launched, with a television production company, one of the most watched paranormal series in American television history, running for 7 seasons and counting. And we have told the story of the land itself, the Uinta Basin, the old lake bed, the oil beneath the surface, the mountains to the north, the wind, the sagebrush, the stars. That is the story, or that is one telling of the story. There are others. There will be others in the years to come. Some will emphasize the skeptical side and will point out with careful patience that the extraordinary claims made about the ranch have never been supported by evidence sufficient for scientific publication. Others will emphasize the believer's side and will argue with equal patience that the sheer volume of testimony from people who have been on the property, people whose credibility in ordinary matters is high, is itself a form of evidence, one that cannot be dismissed. Both sides will have their good arguments and their weaker arguments and their true observations and their overreaches. The debate will continue, as debates about these things always do, without ever quite arriving at a settled conclusion. But the ranch will remain. The ranch will remain, as it always has, at the base of the ridge, in the wide open bowl of the basin, under the enormous sky. And the ridge will remain above it, as it always has, silent and patient, holding whatever it holds, if it holds anything at all. And the wind will remain, and the sage will remain, and the cottonwoods along the creek will remain, and the meadowlark on the fence post will remain, calling in the morning as it has always called. And you, in the quiet safety of your own bed, far from that country, will remain, warm and still, and drifting gently towards sleep, with the small comfort of knowing that the world holds many mysteries, and that not all of them require an answer tonight. Not all of them require an answer ever. Some of them are simply there, on the edge of what we know, waiting, patient as the ridge above the ranch, and they are content, in their patience, to be watched and to watch back. Let us breathe now, deeply, once more. Let us imagine that we are lying under a sky full of stars, that the ranch is far below us, and the ridge is far below us, and the basin is far below us, and everything strange that has ever happened, or been said to have happened in that country, is small and distant now, tucked far away in the folds of the land. We are just here, breathing. The stars turn slowly. The world is very old. The wind moves. Let us drift now into a kind of long, slow reverie. Let us imagine ourselves walking in soft moccasins that make no sound on the ground along the edge of the ranch in a night that is warm and still. We do not need to hurry. There is nowhere we need to be. We are simply out for a walk along the low fence line in the starlight. We pass the outbuildings, the old barn, weathered wood, standing quietly, the corrals, empty now at this hour, the equipment sheds, all of them silent, all of them still. We come to the edge of the pasture. The cattle are bedded down in the far corner, dark shapes against the darker ground. They are asleep in the way that cattle sleep, light, watchful, ready to rise if they need to, but at rest for now. We follow the fence line west toward the creek.
The creek is a soft murmur off to our left, hidden in the willows. We can smell the water, that particular fresh, cool scent of running water in a dry country. We can smell the willows themselves, faintly bitter, faintly sweet. We come to a place where the fence turns. We stop there, and we look up. Above us, the sky is a great slow river of stars. The Milky Way arches from horizon to horizon, its central band bright enough that you can see the dust lanes within it, the darker shadows against the paler background. There are constellations we know, and there are stars we do not know. There are the small red pinpricks of Mars, low in the west, and the steady bright yellow of some large planet, Jupiter perhaps, higher up. There are satellites moving in their slow arcs. There are no other lights. There is nothing on the ridge. There is nothing crossing the field. There is only the vast quiet of the basin and the vast quiet of the sky, and us standing at the fence line, breathing. We stand there for a long time. It is not a frightened standing. It is not a watchful standing. It is just a standing in the presence of something very old and very large. The way a person might stand on the shore of an ocean at night and listen to the waves. The way a person might stand on the edge of a great canyon and look down. There is no urgency. There is no expectation. There is only the fact of being here at the edge of something ancient and letting it be what it is. After a while we turn and we walk back along the fence line, past the pasture, past the corrals, past the old barn, back toward the small ranch house. There is a light on in one window, a scientist reading perhaps, or a security guard drinking coffee, or perhaps just a lamp that someone left on and has not thought to switch off. The porch is quiet. The wind is quiet. Even the cottonwoods are quiet now, in this hour before dawn. We go inside. We lie down in a small guest room on a bed that has been made with cool, clean sheets. We pull the blanket up. We close our eyes. The ranch continues around us. The cameras continue to hum. The wind continues to move. The ridge continues to stand in its long, patient watch, whatever it is watching for. We continue to breathe, slowly, slowly, in, out. The world holds us, as it always has. Let us drift a little further now. Let us think about time. The ridge above the ranch has been there for tens of millions of years. It was formed in the great uplifts that raised the Colorado Plateau to its current height. Before that, the material of the ridge was mud and sand at the bottom of an inland sea. Before that, the material was something else, the eroded remains of older mountains, worn down over hundreds of millions of years by rain and wind. Compared to the ridge, the story we have been telling, the story of the ranch and the Shermans and Bigelow and the Pentagon and Fugal and the television show, is a matter of moments, a blink, a single breath. Even the story of the Utes and of their ancestors going back 1,000 years or more is only a small fraction of the life of the ridge. Even the story of the Fremont people who came before the Utes in this country and who left their petroglyphs on the canyon walls is only a small fraction of the life of the ridge. The ridge does not care. The ridge does not think in the sense that we think. It only endures. It only stands in the wide open bowl of the basin under the enormous sky, hour by hour, year by year, century by century, as the small stories of the humans below unfold and end and begin again. There is something restful, I think, in that thought. Restful and humbling. Whatever is happening at Skinwalker Ranch, whatever the Sherman family saw or thought they saw in the pastures, whatever the scientists recorded or failed to record in the years of their investigation, whatever the videos show that the Navy pilots took over the deserts of the American Southwest, whatever the answers to these questions turn out to be in 100 years or 500 or 1,000, the ridge will still be there. The stars will still be there. The wind will still move down out of the mountains at dusk and stir the leaves of the cottonwoods along the creek. And that is a comfort. It is a comfort to know that whatever strangeness the world holds, and whatever explanations we eventually find or fail to find, the great slow rhythms of the earth continue. The seasons turn, the rivers flow, the stars above the basin come out at night and are gone in the morning and come out again. We are small in the presence of such things, but we are also part of them. We are part of the same long story. Our breathing in and out is a small version of the great tides of the earth. Our sleeping and waking is a small version of the great turning of the sun and the moon and the stars. Our questions and our patience and our fear and our wonder are all part of what the land and the ridge and the sky have always seen in the small creatures who move across them. Let us breathe once more, slowly, in, out. Let us let ourselves drift. We are on the ranch, but we are also in our own bed. We are in the Uinta Basin, but we are also wherever we happen to be tonight, in the wider world. We are watching the ridge, and the ridge is watching back, but there is nothing to fear, and nothing to solve, and nothing to prove. There is only this, the fact of being here in the world at this particular moment, with the story of Skinwalker Ranch in our thoughts, and the stars turning slowly overhead, and the wind moving in the cottonwoods along a creek we may never see. The story will continue after tonight. New seasons of the television show will air. New scientists will investigate. New videos may emerge. New witnesses may come forward, and new skeptics may point out, patiently, the many ordinary explanations for extraordinary reports. The debate will go on in the way that these debates always go on, without a final resolution into whatever future our species has ahead of it. But we do not need to follow that story any further tonight. We have followed it far enough. We have carried it in our minds from the ridge to the ranch to the newspaper to the billionaire to the scientists to the senator to the Pentagon to the television show to the ridge again. It is a long story, and it is a strange one, and we have honored it by paying attention. That is all that any story really asks of us: attention, patience, a willingness to sit with it in the quiet and let it be what it is. Now, let us set it down. Let us set the story down gently, the way you would set down a stone that you have been carrying in your pocket all day. You are not throwing it away. You are just putting it down for the night. You can pick it up again in the morning if you want to, or you can let someone else pick it up, or you can leave it there in the place where you set it and forget about it until some other night when it comes back to you. The stone is small. The stone is quiet. The stone does not need to be held any longer. Let us breathe. In, out. Let us drift. The ranch is still there if we want to think about it. The ridge is still there. The Ute grandmothers still know what their grandmothers knew, and they still hold their knowledge quietly, and they still teach their grandchildren in soft voices not to go up on that ridge. The scientists still, from time to time, review their old notes. The reporter, George Knapp, still, from time to time, gives interviews. Brandon Fugel, at his home in Utah, still, from time to time, takes the helicopter out to the ranch to see what his security team has to show him. Robert Bigelow, in Las Vegas, still, from time to time, thinks of the property he owned for 20 years and wonders, perhaps, what became of the questions he tried for a while to answer. All of that continues. The story goes on, but we are done with it for tonight. Tonight, we are here, just here, warm and safe and drifting. Let us think one last time about the small good things that the story has brought us, because there are small good things even in a story as strange as this one. The story has reminded us that the world is large, larger than we sometimes remember in the small round of our daily lives. There are wide open basins in the western part of our continent where the sky at night is filled with more stars than we can count. There are cultures on this continent that have lived on the land for hundreds and hundreds of generations and that carry knowledge in their languages and stories that no library holds. There are questions still about what moves in the sky and what moves on the ground, and what, if anything, moves in the shadows of a ridge above a ranch in Utah. The world has not been fully accounted for. There are still edges. There are still frontiers. The story has reminded us that curiosity is a long thing. It can travel from a single newspaper article in 1996 to a national conversation 20 years later. It can move through the minds of many different people: a rancher, a reporter, a scientist, a billionaire, a senator, a Pentagon official, a television producer, and each of them adds something to it, and each of them changes it a little, and eventually the collective work of all those minds produces something that no one of them could have produced alone. Curiosity is patient. Curiosity waits. Curiosity does not always find its answers, but it does keep the questions alive, and keeping questions alive is, in itself, a kind of gift. The story has reminded us that places have meaning, that a specific piece of land in a specific corner of the world can accumulate stories over time until it becomes something more than a piece of land. It becomes a place, and places, once they exist, have a kind of gravity of their own. They pull thought toward them. They shape memory. They belong in some sense to everyone who has ever heard of them, even those who have never set foot on them. The story has reminded us that there are people who spend their lives paying careful attention, reporters who keep asking questions, scientists who keep taking measurements, ranchers who keep records of every unusual thing that happens on their property, elders who keep telling their grandchildren the old warnings. All of them, in their own ways, are engaged in the same work, the work of noticing, the work of remembering, the work of holding on to what might otherwise be lost. And the story has reminded us, above all, that the earth is old, and that we are new, and that whatever mysteries the earth still holds, it holds them patiently, and it will still hold them tomorrow, and the next day, and the day after that. Let us breathe. Let us let our shoulders soften. Let us feel the weight of our body against the bed and let it settle. Let us imagine one more time the ranch at rest. It is very late now. The cameras hum on their poles. The security team drinking coffee watches the monitors and sees nothing unusual. The cattle sleep in the far corner of the pasture. The cottonwoods along the creek move gently in the wind. The stars above the basin turn slowly in their ancient and unbothered way. The ridge stands quiet as it has stood for millions of years. The ridge will still be there tomorrow. We do not need to watch it. We can sleep. Let the story rest where we have left it. Let the ranch remain where it is. Let the Uinta Basin hold its own night in its own way. Let the wind move as it wishes. Let the meadowlark, when the morning finally comes, call from its fence post, and let the sun rise in its usual place over the same land it has risen over for as long as anyone can remember, and let the cattle stir, and let the cottonwoods glow gold in the first light, and let the ridge, silent and patient, catch the first warmth of the day. That is all still to come. That is not for us tonight. Tonight, we are here, in our own bed, in our own quiet room, and the story of a strange ranch in Utah has been our companion for these hours, and we have listened, and we have wondered, and we have felt the presence of the great old land far away, holding its own patient watch under its own patient stars. Now let us close our eyes. Now let us breathe. Now let us feel the softness of the bed beneath us, and the cool of the air, and the quiet of our own room, and the safety of our own walls. Now let us drift. The ranch is far away. The ridge is far away. The wind in the cottonwoods is far away. The stars above the basin are far away. But we are here, warm, safe, held. The world will still be there in the morning. All the mysteries will still be there. All the questions will still be there. All the strange stories, and all the stubborn skeptics, and all the patient investigators, and all the quiet grandmothers, and all the enduring ridges, and all the endless stars. They will keep. They will wait. For now, there is only this: the slow rise and fall of your breath, the soft weight of your body against the bed, the gentle drift of thought, no longer urgent, no longer sharp, becoming softer, becoming rounder, becoming easier to let go of, one thought at a time. The ranch is quiet. The ridge is quiet. The basin is quiet. The sky is quiet. Your room is quiet. Your body is quiet. Your mind is quiet. Sleep now. Sleep well. The old land is watching over its own long night without needing anything from us, and you, at last, can rest and